Hey everybody, War Hamster Brady here, welcoming you to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report. Joining me as always, my good friend, constitutional mentor, Mr. Constitution himself, Douglas V. Gibbs.
Good to see you.
Today we are going to do part 7 of our review of Madison's notes. The reason we're doing this is,
and what's sad is you say part 7 and we're still at the very beginning.
Yeah, it's going to take a while, but it's worth every bit of it. Every show's been worth it. There hasn't been anything worth skipping over.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, and the whole reason we're doing this, the whole purpose of the show is to look at, events from a constitutional, original intent Constitution standpoint. And what better way than look at the words of the people that wrote the darn thing, and what do they debate? What do they propose? What do they shoot down? What do they fear? All that stuff, and that's what you're getting on this in this series. And Doug and I add a little bit of historical context to it. It's been a great series. So if you're just getting started here, I do recommend you go to the beginning and watch episodes 1 through 6 first. But each one of those is a self-contained bit of knowledge in and of itself.
Yeah, it's like Star Trek. Each episode can stand on its own.
High praise indeed. All right, so let's jump into today. And where's our handy calendar? We are in Yale University's Avalon, Project Avalon, where you have all kinds of historical documents. Here we have the calendar of the Philadelphia Convention. And we finished off on a Saturday, June 2nd. Everybody went home, spent Sunday at church, came back Monday, June 4th, all ready to rock and roll. And when we left them off, they were really getting into the executive branch. Should there be one executive, or should there be 3? Should it be for 3 years, for 7? How do you remove a president, what have you? So that's what's going on, over the weekend with they debating, and they came back to reconvene on that subject. So Monday, June 4th, 1787, in the Committee of the Whole, which means, I believe, the entire delegation is there. The question was resumed on a motion of Mr. Pinckney, which was seconded by Mr. Wilson. Shall the blank for the number of the executive be filled with a single person? Are we going to have a sole executive or a tribunal of 3? That's what's on the table.
Yeah, remember, for those of you who have been listening, you may have heard me say this, but they're looking back in history. They're seeing, for example, with Rome, when it was a Roman kingdom, there was 10 kings. When it was a Roman republic, you had 2 consuls. And so because there was a fear of one man having all the power, Rome ran into trouble when it went to 1, the emperor. So they're looking at that historically as something to be concerned about.
Excellent. So Mr. James Wilson of Pennsylvania speaks first today, and he's in favor of the motion. He says, it had been opposed by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Randolph, but the arguments used had not convinced him. It's one of the things you'll see with these people. They quite often mix in a bunch of flattery for their opponents. The decorum is fantastic. Sometimes it's maybe with a little bit of a smirk, but the language is pretty consistent.
Right.
He observed that the objections of Mr. Randolph were leveled not so much against the measure itself as against its unpopularity. If he could suppose that it would occasion a rejection of the plan of which should form a part, though the part was an important one, yet he would give it up rather than lose the whole. Saying Randolph doesn't like the single executive because the people won't stand for it. Wilson says, on examination, he could see no evidence of the alleged antipathy of the people. On the contrary, he was persuaded that it does not exist. All know that a single magistrate is not a king.
Now, it's funny, that section right there, as you're reading it, and I'm thinking about stuff that's going on right now, I said, wow, as much as things change, they stay the same. Certain forces want to convince you that something is there, or it's a feeling is there, or an attitude is there, or a division is there, when it doesn't exist.
I read your article yesterday, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And we'll be discussing that article, I think, in our radio show later today.
Okay.
Because I enjoyed it, and I got a couple things to add to it, so I think we should spend a segment on it.
Okay, very good.
One fact has great weight with him. All the 13 states, though agreeing in scarce any other instance, agree in placing a single magistrate at the head of government. This would be called state-led states. The states are led by a single governor, is what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of three heads has taken place in none. The degree of power is indeed different, but there are no coordinate heads. In addition to his former reasons for preferring a unity, he would mention another. The tranquility not less than the vigor of the government, he thought would be favored by it. Among three equal members, he foresaw nothing but uncontrolled, continued, and violent animosities. He's probably right on that.
I think so. Because if you think about it just for a second, how are the three chosen? So the majority's probably going to pull off the first or the first two, but then the minority's probably going to get their third one in because there's only going to be so many candidates. And you're going to wind up with the same situation they wound up having with the vice president and president winded up being different parties because the second place winner was the vice president.
And with a three-headed monster, you could almost get three different factions, and then nobody's going to agree. And they'll talk about that here.
And even if they were all the same same faction, same party, or the same faction per se, there's going to be those differences. And it goes back to like the war. When there were a lot of different voices, when the states had a voice on where the militia is going to go, and the Congress has a voice on what the deployment's going to be, and the general who's on the field is saying, "Wait a second," but my opinion is they said, "Well, we're going to override you." It was a problem. We were losing battles. In certain things, you got to have a single figurehead.
Mm-hmm. No, the war was definitely the best example of that. We've got some great historical examples of, attempts at tribunals, and they did not last long. Rome tried it. Greece had something similar. A number of city-states have done something along those lines. It's just, it is not, does not give itself to longevity.
Well, and Wilson, what he's drawing from, this is what I appreciate. He's saying, hey, we got examples right here in our own country. The governor. Now, granted, the level of power is different, but the position is essentially the same, and it's an executive. And then he goes to the people. What are the people going to think? And the people are going to feel more confident when they have, and this is just our own human nature, we have somebody leading the way. Now, at the same time, they recognize that we don't want someone with too much power. They recognize their own history under a monarch and all that. So it comes back to something I say often. So how do we find the balance? Well, we have a single leader who's strong, because we need a strong leader, but yet limited so that he doesn't become tyrannical. You got to find, once again, that balance, that happy medium.
Very good. And they're going to talk about that more today. So let's jump forward. It's talking about the violent animosities, which would not only interrupt the public administration, but diffuse their poison through the other branches of government, through the states.
Hang on. Diffuse their poison.
Yeah.
I love the way that's put. What happens when you have one rotten apple in the barrel, right? Go ahead.
That's what he's saying. And he says it would go through the branches of government, through the states, and at length through the people at large. If the members were to be unequal in power in principle, opposition to the unity was given up. If equal, the making them an odd number would not be a remedy. In courts of justice, there are two sides only to a question. In legislative and executive departments, questions have commonly many sides. Each member, therefore, might espouse a separate one and no two agree. That's what I just said earlier.
Yeah, and that goes back to something I talk about where people talk about the two-party system, the dangers of the two-party system, and we naturally do it. And someone says, well, we should have many parties. Okay, well, Austria, they have 15 parties. But what winds up happening is, you wind up with two coalitions. They coalesce into one side or another. But because there's 15 parties, nobody has a majority. So nothing gets done because nobody has enough votes to get anything done.
Sounds like a good government to me.
Well, yeah, but sometimes sometimes there has to be decisions made. And when it comes to the executive, especially because the executive's job, we got to remember in today's society, what we see as the executive and what they were intending are two different things. The executive only, for the most part, would have a job that dealt with the foreign stage, external issues. And that you do need one person to represent the country. That you do need someone who's decisive and firm in their stance. Remember, the domestic authorities of the president are almost essentially zero, except for maybe when it comes to certain things that would preserve the union, executing laws that would preserve the unions, like, postal or something like that. Taxes.
Very good. All right, moving on. Mr. Roger Sherman of Connecticut speaks next. He says, this matter is of great importance and ought to be well considered before it is determined. Mr. Wilson, he said, had observed that in each state a single magistrate was placed at the head of government. It was so, he admitted, and properly so, and he wished the same policy to prevail in the federal government. But then it should also be also remarked that in all the states there was a council of advice, without which the first magistrate could not act. A council he thought necessary to make the establishment acceptable to the people. Even in Great Britain, the king has a council, and though he appoints it himself, its advice has its weight with him and attracts the confidence of the people.
There's an argument for not only the cabinet, but Mr. Sherman, and we do need to spotlight him down the road, and I think we will. Roger Sherman of Connecticut was one of those voices, and I know I don't want to be a spoiler here, but so Warhamster and I earlier were talking about the Benjamin Franklin and how Benjamin was so respected. Sherman was the same way. He was one of those highly respected voices. And so what he's saying here is being seriously taken into consideration.
Moving on. Mr. Williamson responds. This is Mr. Williamson from North Carolina, Hugh Williamson. He asked Mr. Wilson whether he means to annex a council. Mr. Wilson means to have no council, which oftener serves to cover than prevent malpractices. So there's an argument.
Now, see, remember, what we wind up with is the cabinet, which are the department heads. So you're looking for a balance here. You don't want a direct council, but you need to have some council.
And we saw the perils of we saw that happen very early on when, the original cabinet, which I think was 3 members, and one of which, the Secretary of the Treasury, is Alexander Hamilton, who had an inordinate amount of influence on everything that was going on. It's dangerous if you have the wrong cabinet. Mr. Gary was at a loss to discover the policy of 3 members for the executive. It would be extremely inconvenient in many instances, particularly in military matters, whether relating to the militia, an army, or a navy. It would be a general with 3 heads, kind of stating the obvious. On the question for a single executive, it was agreed to. Massachusetts, Connecticut were both ayes. New York was a no. Pennsylvania was an aye. Delaware is a no. Maryland's a no. Virginia's an aye. A little bit of split because Colonel Mason was a no. George Mason, once again, he was not in the House, they say. Mr. Withy was aye, but he'd gone home. And then North Carolina,
it's
South Carolina, and Georgia said aye. Go ahead.
Yeah, Wythe, W-Y-T-H-E. It's Wythe, and some people might say With. I went to his house there in Virginia. In Williamsburg, they have a replica or the original house. I'm not sure if it's which, but fascinating. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, in fact, while you're on that topic, 2 weeks from now,
actually, it was With. Go ahead.
Yeah, 2 weekends from now, we are for my birthday weekend. We're going to go to Newport, Rhode Island, and we'll be visiting all the mansions of the robber barons from the Gilded Age. So that's going to be a lot of fun. I will take some good pictures. Vanderbilt, so here I come.
Been there. It's didn't spend a lot of time there. Been there. It is fascinating. Anyway, go ahead.
So anyway, the question of whether we're going to have a single executive passed. So one single executive they've agreed on. And we're seeing they can change their
But
mind.
look at there was some splits, and I want us to look at something here. Who were the no's?
First one's in New York. And we have New York, Delaware, Maryland, and George Mason.
Yeah, you have smaller states and the home and the strongholds of what would become the anti-federalists. The anti-federalists had such a stronghold on New York that's who the Federalist Papers were written to. Delaware, small state. Maryland, small state. And Colonel Mason, father of the anti-federalists. Just wanted to point that out. Go ahead.
And for those who don't know, I am a big fan of George Mason. All right, the first clause of Proposition the 8th relating to a council of revision is taken into consideration. Mr. Gary doubts whether the judiciary ought to form a part of it, as they will have a sufficient check against encroachments on their own department by their exposition of the laws, which involved a power of deciding on their constitutionality. He's talking about judicial review.
Yeah. So, this is important because, and Warhamster and I've talked about this before when it comes to judicial review, which was in a sense codified by the courts anyway, with Marbury versus Madison, 1803. It didn't exist in the system before that. And when I get into debates with people, I have to remind them it did get brought up during the Constitutional Convention, and it was not codified in the language of the Constitution. And this is the first instance where we really see it brought up. But what's interesting, and this is my final part about this, Mr. Gary doesn't talk about the potential or the possibility. He talks about it as if it's already a done deal.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not. What I like to say when I have this conversation, I go, look, judicial review was proposed in Philadelphia, debated, and shot down resoundingly, which we're about to see. Here's the reason behind it. He says in some states, the judges had actually set aside laws as being against the Constitution. This was done too with general approbation. It was quite foreign from the nature of ye office to make them judges of the policy of public measures. He moves to postpone the clause in order to propose that the national executive shall have a right to negative any legislative act which shall not be afterwards passed by a certain number of parts of each branch of the national legislature.
This had actually been a recommendation by Madison in conversation even prior to the convention. So Mr. Gary is just echoing something that Madison had already brought up before, that the national legislature, Congress, could negative state law. Let's see how that goes over with the rest of the congregants.
Yeah. He's also introducing here the veto. Right. The national executive can negative any legislative act that the Congress passes, which was not overridden by, and he wouldn't specify what that majority should be. It should be 2/3, 3/4, what have you, to override a veto. But that's what this is really introducing to us. He's actually saying two things in this paragraph. So Mr. King seconds the motion, observing that the judges ought to be able to expound the law as it should come before them, free from the bias of having participated in its formation. It's an interesting point.
They're not the lawgivers, they're not the lawmakers, they're an outside voice.
Mr. Wilson thinks neither the original proposition nor the amendment go far enough. If the legislative, executive, judiciary ought to be distinct and independent, the executive ought to have an absolute negative. Without such a self-defense, the legislature can at any moment sink it into non-existence. He was for varying the proposition in such a manner as to give the executive and judiciary jointly an absolute negative. I mean, the president has an absolute veto. He can cancel anything Congress does. And if you don't give him that power, Congress will just cancel him. Not the strongest argument. On the question of whether to postpone the order to take Mr. Gary's proposition into consideration, it was agreed to. Almost all ayes and just a couple nays. So, Mr. Gary's proposition is now before the committee. Mr. Wilson and Mr. Hamilton move that the last part of it, which, in quotes, which not be afterwards passed unless by blank parts of Congress or the national legislature be struck out, so as to give the executive an absolute negative on the laws. Hamilton and Wilson want the president to have considerably more power than he ended up getting. It's important to remember because Hamilton will later on talk about how he wants an elected king.
And remember, when they talk about this absolute negative, they're not saying that it's absolute and it cannot be questioned. They're saying that would be absolute in the totality of the law. In other words, there's no line item veto here.
Yeah. Congress does whatever they want, and the president gets to gives a thumbs up or thumbs down.
Right.
There was no danger, they thought, of such a power being too much exercised. It was mentioned by Colonel Hamilton that the King of Great Britain had not exerted his negative since the Revolution. Meaning, since America fought back, the king had stopped overriding the parliaments for the 10 years.
Already lost one set of colonies. He didn't want to lose more. Go ahead.
All right. Mr. Gary sees no necessity for so great a control over the legislature, as the best men in the community would be comprised in the two branches of it. Kind of missed that one, didn't he? Okay. Here's where it gets fun. Enters Dr. Franklin, Benjamin Franklin.
And notice this about Benjamin Franklin. He's quiet a lot, but then when he does speak, it's usually pretty extensive. But he spends a lot of time in thought. He watches, he observes, he thinks about it. He's probably writing it down because, as we talked about last week, he mentioned he writes it down so he doesn't forget his thoughts. Remember, he's 81, but he spends a lot of time in thinking. So you don't see him speak often, but when he does, it's a paragraph. Go ahead. Yeah,
and as Doug talked about before we came on the air, Franklin's has a tendency to be very witty, and both in his compliments and in his insults. And you're going to see an example of that right here. So Dr. Franklin said he was sorry to differ from his colleague, for whom he had a very great respect on any occasion, but he could not help it on this. That's the praise before the insult.
Hey, I hate to differ on you guys, but
he had some experience on this check in the executive and the legislature under the proprietary government of Pennsylvania. The negative of the governor was constantly made use to extort money. No good law whatever could be passed without a private bargain with him. An increase of his salary or some donation was always made a condition, till at last it became the regular practice to have orders in his favor on the treasury presented along with the bills to be signed, so that he might actually receive the former before he should sign the latter. I'm going to keep going with this, and I'm going to give you some history of Pennsylvania, what he's talking about. I'll do it right now. Give me 1 second. I just got to pull up a quick note here. So Pennsylvania, the colony, was founded by William Penn. Mm-hmm. And the story was the crown, the king of England, owed him some kind of debt, and that was his way of getting paid back for it.
Yeah, so even the creation of the colony was a deal.
Yeah. And, well, Franklin, being from Pennsylvania, opposed. So as the governor, he basically was a ruling monarch of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And he had all kinds of powers that no other governor really would have. Franklin, of course, in the parliament opposed him quite a bit for decades. And this is him. Ben Franklin is actually sarcastically ripping on the guy.
And speaking from experience.
Yeah. So let me just read some quick notes on this. During the Revolution, Pennsylvania's revolutionary government abolished the proprietary charter granted to the Penn family by King Charles II in 1681. In 1776, the Pennsylvania Constitution stripped the Penns of their governing authority over the colony. All proprietary functions, including governance appointments and land control, were ended by the new legislature. So the Penns had roughly 24 million acres in the state of Pennsylvania. Very wealthy family. Obviously, they were on the wrong side of the Revolutionary War, and the family would end up back in England, still rather wealthy. And there would be a settlement with the colonies in the Penns, basically where the Pennsylvania bought back some of the land from the Penns. What else do we have? There's a couple of, because after the Revolution, much of the land was confiscated by the new state government, but their private assets were largely retained. So the Penns were getting like a lifetime annuity from the British government, about £4,000 a year. They got that for which says in writing, recognition of the loss of their proprietary rights, basically compensating them for losing the war. And then Pennsylvania would agree to pay the Penn heirs about £130,000, or roughly $20 million. The Penn family really kind of disappeared from America at that point in time. But that is your history of Pennsylvania.
Now remember also, you've got the heavy Quaker influence, and Quakers being pacifists were against the war, and the Penns basically echoed that sentiment. But then you have folks that weren't necessarily Quakers, and some Quakers said, "No, we got to stand on, our principles." Franklin leading that charge. So, yeah,
they would actually pass something called the Compensation Act of 1790, which basically settled all the disputes over the Penn holdings. So these were honorable men. We took away your land, Penns, you Tories, but here's a little bit of money to make up for it.
Right.
All right, continuing on about this. So that's what Franklin's talking about, is this tyrannical governor of the hereditary Penns of Pennsylvania. He says, when the Indians were scalping the Western people and notice of it arrived, the concurrence of the governor in the means of self-defense could not be got till it was agreed that his estate should be exempted from taxation. So this guy's a shakedown artist.
Right.
So that the people were to fight for the security of his property, whilst he was to bear no share of the burden. This was a mischievous sort of check. If the executive was to have a council, such a power would be less objectionable. It was true that the King of Great Britain had not, as was said, exerted his negative since the Revolution, but that matter was easily explained. The bribes and emoluments now given to the members of Parliament rendered it unnecessary, everything being done according to the will of the ministers. He was afraid, if a negative should be given as proposed, that more power and money would be demanded, till at last enough would be gotten to influence and bribe the legislature into a complete subjugation to the will of the executive. Franklin's been around. He knew some things.
And we talk about, and I talk about this all the time, about there's more willing and dealing on the floor of Congress than there is at Wall Street, and this is nothing new, as you see.
Yeah, and you've seen what happens when you get a president with too much power, and he's basically has complete dominance in D.C. Bad things happen to our country.
Right.
Mr. Sherman was against enabling any one man to stop the will of the whole. No one man could be found so far above all the rest in wisdom. He thought we ought to avail ourselves of his wisdom in revising the laws, but not permit him to overrule the decided and cool opinions of the legislature. So he's arguing for the president not having a veto.
Once again, remember, all these compromises, all these debates ultimately bring about balance in the Constitution. That's one of the reasons why I love that document so much. The Constitution is because they, in their debates, they eliminated the extremes. Go ahead.
Yeah, very much so. And you'll see some of the extreme ideas proposed. We have already. Mr. Madison supposed that if a proper proportion of each branch should be required to overrule the objections of the executive, it would answer the same purpose as an absolute negative. This is what we ended up getting. Madison is proposing the solution. You need to have 2/3 of a body or whatever. We haven't decided on the number yet, but you can overrule a veto.
Mm-hmm.
But it's got to be a really strong majority. It would rarely, if ever, happen that the executive constituted, as ours is proposed to be, would have firmness enough to resist the legislature unless backed by a certain part of the body itself. The King of Great Britain, with all his splendid attributes, would not be able to withstand the unanimous and eager wishes of both houses of Parliament. To give such a prerogative would certainly be obnoxious to the temper of this country, its present temper at least. Meaning, Madison saying, you try to do this, the people are going to be ticked off.
Yeah, they've already shown that they can overthrow an entire empire. You guys are nothing, and they'll make their voice known.
Yeah, pitchforks are sharp. Mr. Wilson believed, as others did, that this power would be seldom used. The legislature would know that such a power existed and would refrain from such laws as it would be sure to defeat. Interesting observation. And of course, veto hasn't been overused with the exception of who's Lincoln's VP? Andrew Johnson.
Andrew Johnson.
Yeah, he was the veto king.
Yeah, but you take into consideration what he was up against, you kind of understand. It really wasn't overused. It was just used a lot. We had two extremes going on there, and I don't even think Johnson was as much of an extreme as the Republican Congress was, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, Lincoln had named Johnson as his VP as a compromise, sort of an olive branch to the Democrats. So he wanted a Democrat VP. So when Lincoln gets assassinated,
but Johnson was a very sensible Democrat at the time.
Yeah, he was acceptable to Lincoln. But what happens is, once Lincoln dies, you've got basically a one-party system. The Republican Party was just dominating the next several decades, and they tried to pass him obnoxious stuff, and he just had the veto out left and right. That's why they impeached him and almost got rid of him. They missed by one vote.
Yep.
That's what single-party rule does to you people. It's dangerous.
Yeah, even if you think it's the good guys, not that there are good guys and bad guys, often.
All right, it says its silent operation would therefore preserve harmony and prevent mischief. The case of Pennsylvania formerly was very different from its present case. The executive was not then, as now, to be appointed by the people. It will not, in this case, as the one cited, be supported by the head of a great empire, actuated by a different and sometimes opposite interest. He's saying is the Penns, the governors of Pennsylvania, were not elected by the people. These ones will be. The salary, too, is now proposed to be fixed by the Constitution, or if Dr. Franklin's ideas should be adopted, all salary, whatever, interdicted. The requiring a large proportion of each house to overrule the executive check might do in peaceable times, but there might be tempestuous moments in which animosities may run high between the executive and legislative branches, and in which the former ought to be able to defend itself. The former being the executive. Can it defend itself from the legislative?
So he's recommending give the legislature the ability to override the veto, but make it difficult. And just be aware that there may be times where the animosity between the two branches may run high. Make sure this president is firm. Make sure he's energetic. Give him the ability to veto, but there has to be some type of check and balance.
Mr. Butler then speaks up, and this is once again Pierce Butler from South Carolina. He had been in favor of an executive magistrate, but could he have entertained an idea that a complete negative on the laws was to be given to him? He certainly should have acted very differently. Saying, wait, I want a president, but whoa, back off on these powers. It had been observed that in all countries, the executive power is in a constant course of increase.
Very important statement. United States is not immune. We have not been immune from that.
Yeah, it is the nature of central power to expand. Yeah. And it can only, in America, we only have one tool to decrease it, because Congress is not going to decrease its own power, and that's the Article 5 convention. And we've never used it in almost 250 years, and that's one of the reasons we're in the mess we're in today.
Mm-hmm.
This was certainly the case in Great Britain. Gentlemen seem to think that we have nothing to apprehend from an abuse of the executive power, but why might not a Catiline or a Cromwell arise in this country as well as in others? That's an important observation. You're saying, we are not immune from somebody gaining too much power, a cult of personality, have you? And we've seen it as the executive branch has become far greater than anything was ever intended. And each president, just basically builds on his predecessors. Very few of them have taken a step backwards. All right, Mr. Bedford speaks next, and I think we should talk about Mr. Bedford a second because he's an interesting guy. So we're going to make him our little profile.
Okay.
Can you see Mr. Gunning Bedford Jr.?
Yes, sir.
All right. Our weekly profile. Kind of a round-faced guy. All right. He was born in 1747, dies in 1812. He's an American founding father, delegate to the Congress of the Confederation, Attorney General of Delaware, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention that we're talking about, and he's a signer of the Constitution, a U.S. District Judge, and a U.S. District Judge for the District of Delaware. Born in Pennsylvania, fifth of 11 children to a wealthy family, graduates College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton. He is a classmate of James Madison. He was admitted to the Delaware bar and practiced in Dover from 79 to 83. He's in this Continental Congress, which we're talking about, fought in the war. Interesting, his job in the war was to muster the troops. On June 8, 1776, he's promoted to Muster Master General and assigned to New York. He served briefly as an aide to George Washington. Most of the rest of his stuff is just legal and wasn't really too exciting. But I thought that was really, first of all, the part he was Madison's classmate is interesting. But his job in the war.
And having a judicial background, that he's very involved in the judicial end of things, that hopefully gives you an idea of kind of the way he thinks.
Yeah, and he's a Delaware guy, and we've already talked about, this is coming from a small state perspective. And Delaware has always been a little different. All right. Not a big profile, but worth looking at. So what does Mr. Butler have to say today? I'm sorry, Mr. Bedford. He was opposed to every check on the legislative, even the council revision first proposed. He thought it would be sufficient to mark out in the Constitution the boundaries to the legislative authority, which would give all the requisite security to the rights of the other departments. How'd that work out?
Well, partly it did, in the sense that all legislative authorities only belong to the legislative branch, and those boundaries are supposed to exist, but not exactly in the manner that he wanted.
Yeah, he's saying, look, if we write it, they won't abuse it, and that's a little naive. Representatives of the people were the best judges of what was for their interest and ought to be under no external control whatsoever. The two branches would produce a sufficient control within the legislature itself.
Now, what he's saying is the legislature would be self-checking, and while it was after the final product, not in the manner that he was talking about. What really became that natural check was the fact that one was representative voice of the people, the other one being the representative voice of the states appointing the senators. But at this point, this has not been discussed per se, although it is in the Virginia plan, just not in the way that it winds up being. And so whether or not he's drawing from that, one wonders.
All right, here comes George Mason with a long paragraph. An important one, too. He observed that a vote had already passed, he found, he was out at the time, for vesting the executive powers in a single person. Among these powers was that of appointing to offices in certain cases. The probable abuses of a negative had been well explained by Dr. Franklin, as proved by experience, the best of all tests. said, "Will not the same door be opened here? The executive may refuse to assent to necessary measures till new appointments shall be referred to him, and having by degrees engrossed all these into his own hands, the American executive, like the British, will by bribery and influence save himself the trouble and odium of exerting his negative afterwards." He's worried that the executive will be able to extort Congress to give him more power. Otherwise, if he has the negative, the ability to veto, otherwise he'll never let anything pass. It's a legitimate concern, and that's pretty consistent with what George Mason would say throughout, and also in the Anti-Federalist Papers. He's very concerned that this government's going to have too much power and it will be abused. Which is why Mason's one of my favorites. "We are, Mr. Chairman, going very far in this business. We are not indeed constituting a British government, but a more dangerous monarchy, an elective one." That's a powerful sentence. "We are introducing a new principle into our system and not necessary as in the British government, where the executive has greater rights to defend. Do gentlemen mean to pave the way to a hereditary monarchy? Do they flatter themselves that the people will ever consent to such an innovation? If they do, I venture to tell them they are mistaken. The people will never consent." So you're going to have a revolution on your hands, people, if you keep going down this path. "And do gentlemen consider the danger of delay and the still greater danger of a rejection, not for a moment but forever, of the plan which shall be proposed to them?" Means what happens if the people reject this Constitution because you're trying to make too strong of a government? You'll blow your golden opportunity. This country will cease to exist. It'll splinter. That's what he's saying. "Notwithstanding the oppressions and injustice experienced among us from the democracy, the genius of the people is in favor of it, and the genius of the people must be consulted."
He's calling for balance there. We know democracy is dangerous, but let's not lurch to the opposite extreme.
He could not but consider the federal system as in effect dissolved by the appointment of this convention to devise a better one. So he's basically saying, well, we had a federal system under the Articles of Confederation, and basically just by meeting here to devise a better one, you are dissolving the old federal system. He's admitting, saying the quiet part out loud. "And do gentlemen look forward to the dangerous interval between the extinction of an old and the establishment of a new government, and to the scenes of confusion which may ensue? He hoped that nothing like a monarchy will ever be attempted in this country. A hatred to its oppressors had carried the people through the late revolution. Will it not be enough to enable the executive to suspend the offensive laws till they should be coolly revised, and the objections to them overruled by a greater majority than was required in the first instance? He could never agree to give up all the rights of the people to a single magistrate. If more than one had been fixed on, greater powers might have been entrusted to the executive. He hoped this attempt to give such powers would have its weight thereafter as an argument for increasing the number of the executive." Saying there's, look, you're going to trust a lot of power to the executive branch. I'll feel more comfortable if that's power spread between three people. He's still trying to get the multi-headed Hydra at the head of the exec. And the argument is that you can't trust a single person with this kind of power, but maybe you could trust three. So that's Mason at his finest. Enter Benjamin Franklin again. "A gentleman from South Carolina," that was Mr. Butler, "a day or two ago called our attention to the case of the Netherlands. He wished the gentleman had been a little fuller and had gone back to the original of that government. The people, being under great obligations to the Prince of Orange, whose wisdom and bravery had saved them, chose him for the stateholder. He did very well. Inconveniences, however, were felt from his powers, which, growing more and more oppressive, they were at length set aside." So talk about European history here, which Franklin knows well. "Still, however, there was a party for the Prince of Orange, which descended to his son, who excited insurrections, spilt a great deal of blood, murdered the De Witts, very powerful Dutch family, and they're very, very prevalent in the United States. The De Witts are one of the founding families. And got the powers revested in the stateholder. Afterwards, another prince had power to excite insurrections and to make stateholdership hereditary. And the present stateholder is ready to wade through a bloody civil war to the establishment of a monarchy. So that's what Franklin is given the example of what happens. How does someone who's a head of a state become a monarchy? Well, this is exactly how. That's the same Prince of Orange who would be put on the throne of England in 1688.
William of Orange.
Yes, William of Orange. And that would that's what part of that deal was, getting the British Bill of Rights, which will come up in this conversation quite a bit. So this is an important bit of history. Colonel Mason had mentioned the circumstances of appointing officers. He knew how that point would be managed. No new appointment would be suffered as heretofore in Pennsylvania, unless it be referred to the executive, so that all profitable offices will be at his disposal. He says, the first man put at the helm will be a good one. Nobody knows what sort may come afterwards. The executive will be always increasing here as elsewhere till it ends in a monarchy.
And, it's funny. He says the first man at the helm will be a good one. Everybody knows in this convention that it's going to be George Washington. I'm a firm believer. They knew it. The Article 2 wound up being fashioned after the man. But how many George Washingtons are there in the world? This is what he's saying. After George Washington, there's not another George Washington waiting in the wings.
No, there is not. All right, on the question for striking out so as to give the executive an absolute negative, those from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, it's unanimous. We will not have an absolute...
Veto is vetoed.
Yep, exactly. And it's interesting, is somebody proposed it and argued for it, and now we have a unanimous no. So the arguments of the day of Mason and Franklin carried the day.
Yeah, they want the legislature to be the strongest of the branches and to be totally left alone. They trust that the representation that's put there is going to be a wise representation, and that you're not going to get the kind of desire for power that you're going to get from an executive. That's their thinking at the time.
I forgot to bring something up on Mr. Bedford, which we like to do with these founding fathers. I'm going to refer to a book, The Masonic Membership of the Founding Fathers. And Mr. Bedford is most certainly Category 1. He was definitely a Mason. He was a member of Lodge 14 at Christiana Ferry in Delaware, receiving his degrees in March of 1782. A bunch of other degrees he got. He was elected first Grand Master of Delaware in 1806, and he was reelected in 1807, and he probably served there as the Grand Master until he died in 1812. So we have a good Freemason here.
What's fascinating to me is it seems like a good number of the Freemasons are also involved in the judiciary. Not all of them, but a number of them. And Bedford being a good example of that. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, that's something we're going to address in our Secret Society series I do with Colonel Towner is, are there any, shall we say, secret organizations within our judicial borough? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it gets interesting because you start getting into Scottish Rites Freemasonry, and of course that was the FBI was founded by Scottish Rites Freemasons, but that's a different show for another day. All right, going back to finish up Madison's notes for the day. All right, so veto got vetoed. Mr. Butler moved that the resolution be altered so as to read, resolved that the national executive have a power to suspend any legislative act for a term of blank months. So that's a semi-veto. We can suspend your bill. It doesn't go into effect. Why don't you go back and fix these things and debate it, is what they're saying. And Dr. Franklin was seconding this motion. Mr. Gary observes.
And by the way, that's essentially what the veto becomes. He sends it back for reconsideration.
Mr. Gary observed that a power of suspending might do all the mischief dreaded from the negative of useful laws, without answering the salutary purpose of checking unjust or unwise ones. It's a good point. That brings up the idea of a pocket veto, but let's save that for later. On the question of forgiving the suspending power, all the states were no. Okay, so he's not going to have the suspending power, at least not officially. On a question for enabling 2/3 of each branch of the legislature to overrule the revisionary check, it passed in the affirmative, sub silentio, and was inserted into the blank of Mr. Gary's motion. So they did pass here. They agreed to the ability to override the veto. On the question on Mr. Gary's motion, which gave the executive alone, without the judiciary, the revisionary control on the laws, unless overruled by 2/3 of each branch, we get ayes from Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The only no's were Connecticut and Maryland. So this is now passed. We've gotten through this day's squabbles. It was moved by Mr. Wilson and seconded by Madison that the following amendments be made to the last resolution after the words National Executive to add, and a convenient number of the National Judiciary. Getting back to judicial review, are we?
Mm-hmm.
An objection of order being taken by Mr. Hamilton to the introduction of the last amendment at this time. Notice was given by Mr. Wilson and Mr. Madison that the same would be moved tomorrow, whereupon Wednesday, the day after, was assigned to reconsider the amendment of Mr. Gary.
In other words, don't be pulling this stuff right here at the end. Let's give it its proper motion and consideration, all of that.
Yeah, and Hamilton is going to be very active in the next couple of days, both in session and outside session.
And mind you, folks, at this point we have more delegates there than we'll have in a few weeks, because right now they're still revising the Articles of Confederation, but it's becoming more and more apparent they're actually creating something new. And by the 6th week, it's fully realized this is a new document, and a few of the delegates will walk out.
Stormed out was probably be a more accurate version of that.
With their hands in the air.
It was then moved and seconded to proceed into consideration of the 9th resolution submitted by Randolph, when on motion to agree on the first clause, namely, resolve the national judiciary be established. It passed in the affirmative. It was then moved and seconded to add these words to the first clause of the 9th resolution, to consist of one supreme tribunal and of one or more inferior tribunals, which passed in the affirmative. So the last minute vote, we said, yeah, we're going to have a judicial branch. All right, we probably have time to jump into the next day. Yeah, we can do about it. Let's get started the next day. There should be some fun arguments here. You ready?
Let's do it.
All right. Tuesday, June 5th. Committee of the Whole. Governor Livingston from New Jersey takes his seat. The words one or more were struck out before inferior tribunals as an amendment to the last clause of resolution. The clause that the national judiciary be chosen by the national legislature being under consideration. all right, we're going to have a national judiciary. How are we going to pick out who they are?
Well, and let's talk about the inferior here, not talking about the Supreme Court. And the question is, when it comes to the inferior courts, how many inferior tribunals will there be? One or more was struck out. They're realizing they're going to need a larger number. Now, that said, understand there is a fear of a federal judiciary. They saw what those judges were doing as a rubber stamp of the king in Britain. And so we should see some of these arguments that are like, I don't know if that's a good idea kind of stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the judges that were appointed in the colonies by the king were basically iron-fisted rule of the king himself. They've had bad experiences, without a doubt, of judges. So this is going to be an important topic. How do we choose who's fit to judge? Mr. Wilson, James, opposed the appointment of judges by the national legislature. Experience showed the impropriety of such appointments by numerous bodies. Intrigue, partiality, and concealment were the necessary consequences. A principal reason for unity in the executive was that officers might be appointed by a single responsible person. Well, part of Wilson's argument is spot on. You do not want the courts to be political animals.
And if they're only being appointed by the legislature, they're serving the legislature. That's the fear.
Yeah, and what have we seen right now? In this day and age, you go in front of a Democrat judge, you're going to get a certain amount of quote unquote justice that's different than if you get a quote unquote Republican judge. So we have not solved. This is a problem that has not been properly solved. How do you completely free the judiciary of political bias?
Right.
We certainly have got more. We have had more than our share of activist judges dating back to 1800. Mr. Rutledge was by no means disposed to grant so great a power to any single person. The people will think we are leaning too much towards monarchy. He was against establishing any national tribunal except a single supreme one. The state tribunals are the most proper to decide in all cases in the first instance.
In other words, original jurisdiction.
Yes. And really, this is the first time we see this argument, but this is one that you and I both made pretty adamantly, that federal courts quite often stick their nose in stuff that should not be their business at all. And the state courts are considered co-equal to the federal courts. When it comes to just inside one state issues, they are supreme. The federal courts should not have any say-so in a lot of these cases. Mm-hmm. But we've basically allowed that states' powers to absolutely erode. Dr. Franklin observed that two modes of choosing the judges had been mentioned, to wit, by the legislature and by the executive. He wished such other modes to be suggested as might occur to the other gentlemen, it being a point of great moment. He would mention the one which he had understood was practiced in Scotland. He then, in a brief and entertaining manner, related a Scotch mode, in which the nomination...
I wish you would have wrote all this down. I would have loved to hear that entertaining manner. But anyway, go ahead.
Noah Franklin said, in which the nomination proceeded from the lawyers, who always selected the ablest of the profession in order to get rid of him and share his practice among themselves. Interesting. I don't even know if Franklin's being serious here. It was here, he said, that the interest of the electors to make the best choice, which should always be made the case if possible.
And we do see at certain levels in the state systems that judges are, more local judges are voted in by the people today. Question is, should it be at the federal level?
Yeah. Like I said, we still haven't necessarily solved this problem. I've never seen a solution that's going to be bulletproof. Maybe AI. That is a joke,
stop.
People.
Yeah, no, I've got an article in my head about what Delta has just done. But anyway, go ahead.
All right. Mr. Madison disliked the election of the judges by the legislature or any numerous body. Besides the danger of intrigue and impartiality, many of the members were not judges of the requisite qualifications. The legislative talents, which were very different from those of a judge, commonly recommended men to the favor of legislative assemblies. It was known, too, that the accidental circumstances of presence and absence, of being a member or not a member, had a very undue influence on the appointment. On the other hand, he was not satisfied with referring the appointment to the executive. He rather inclined to give it to the senatorial branch, as numerous enough to be confided in, as not so numerous to be governed by the motives of the other branch, and as being sufficiently stable and independent to follow their deliberate judgments. He hinted this only and moved that the appointment by the legislature might be struck out and a blank left to be hereafter filled on mature reflection.
Now, notice what's going on here. He's saying, well, maybe our best bet is the Senate. As most of you probably know, what we do it now today is that the executive nominates and the Senate confirms.
Yep.
So this is so recommendation by Madison is taken into serious consideration, but once again, you don't want a single body to have all the power.
I think that's a good place to stop for today and jump back into the next part of the debate when we get back to this next week.
Okay.
But interesting day today. Franklin at his finest. We got to meet Gunning Bedford Jr. a little bit, who's obviously classmates of Madison. And the colony's a pretty small population, so these guys know each other to some degree, even without being classmates. But the debate, you see the debate here, it's over and over again. They're worried about too much power in the hands of too few, and they're worried about the corruption of power and how eventually, men that are not of such strong character will, be attracted to this power and abuse it.
But at the same time, you can't go too little power, because that's the problem with the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, really what they're saying is, okay, we know we need bigger government. We're going to give it a little more power, but man, how do we protect it from human nature? We've got to put every guardrail in we can. And right. People like George Mason are saying, well, I know you're trying to put guardrails in, but I can see this happening and that happening. And of course, Mason, in hindsight, was right about a lot of this stuff. But that's really the exercise is how do we restrict human nature from ruining this great experiment?
Right.
All right, that's pretty good, but probably good for today. Doug, just tell everyone where they can find you real quick.
DouglasVGibbs.com. Matter of fact, it's right there on your screen, right below my name, DouglasVGibbs.com. Hey, go to the blog regularly. I'm to the point where I'm writing darn near every day. And while I do send a lot of it out to different outlets like Canada Free Press, the best place to find what I write is at DouglasVGibbs.com. Also, I am on the air 6 times, 5 days a week. And we're looking at another one, Patriot Soapbox, which I'm Sunday nights with my friend Alan, wants to give me my own program. I'm also on KMET 1490 AM on Saturdays in the afternoon. In the evenings, KPRZ and KCBQ down in San Diego, The Answer San Diego. And those shows are podcasted. Go to your favorite podcast platform, enter Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V. Gibbs, Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V. Gibbs. And my podcasts are pretty much on all of them of that particular program. Tuesdays, I am teaching the Constitution with my good friend Ron on his Rumble channel, Mr-Constitution.com. And then Wednesdays and Thursdays with Zaki Radio, on Wednesday with, the War Hamster himself, and then on Thursdays, a solo show. So definitely check out all of my programming and the website, DouglasVGibbs.com.
And Doug wrote a great article over the weekend that I read yesterday on basically the whole Epstein fiasco. We may have time to address that in a segment on Zaki Radio today. In a couple hours here, we'll be doing Re-Federalist Radio. I think that'll be our 4th episode. But we got some fun topics on that as well. That's going to be more, that show is less historical and more towards current events, applying the Constitution, the original intent Constitution to current events. But it's a little bit different format than this one. But I hope you guys end up checking out both. Doug, thanks a lot for being here. Everybody, thank you for watching. Until next time, cheers.